Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to everyone joining us tonight. This is the final talk in the first cycle of TACK Talks, where we have been discussing a broad spectrum of design positions and approaches with architecture firms throughout Europe, seeking out the tacit knowledge that is present and needed within the design process, whether it concerns the underlying premises of the design, the unstated assumptions of the client, or the broader societal concerns underpinning the brief, to name but a few moments where we find knowledge that is not codified, but rather implicitly assumed. Tonight's lecture will be furnished by two members of Haworth Tompkins, a London-based design firm that has won over 150 awards, and one of their key positions in their office statement is that they are about values and social purpose more than style. They won the RIBA Sterling Award in 2014, aside from many others. And one unique feature is that many of their members are present in committees that serve broader social purposes than merely the architect's position. So with that, I would like to invite Dan Tassel and Elizabeth Flower to turn on their videos as I introduce them. Dan joined Haworth Tompkins in 2007 and became associate director in 2018. In this time, he was actively involved in projects across higher education, housing, and cultural sectors, and most recently completed a major £30 million project for the Kingston School of Art. Alongside built work, he has led a number of strategic master planning projects for the Royal College of Art, V&A Museum, and Kingston University, and also coordinated Haworth Tompkins' exhibition for the Venice Biennale in 2012. Dan studied at Sheffield University and the Bartlett and has taught at several institutions in the UK and Paris. Elizabeth joined Haworth Tompkins in 2015 and has since worked on a number of projects of the studio's housing, arts and culture and higher education projects. Prior to joining Haworth Tompkins, Elizabeth studied at the University of Manchester and Kingston School of Art, where she was awarded the dissertation medal for her study into the legacy of brutalist architecture, entitled Icons and Monstrosities: The Success and Failure of Post-War Social Housing. Her particular interest in the reuse of existing buildings has led her to working on several historic refurbishment projects, and she is currently project architect on the refurbishment and reconfiguration of the Warburg Institute. Tonight, they will share with us some of the firm's projects, and especially aimed at the kind of questions they address, particular issues they see as unique to their design approach. And with that, I'd like to hand the floor to Dan. Welcome both and looking forward to it.
Thank you, Lara, for the introduction. I'm just going to try and share my screen. Bear with me a second. So I'm hoping everyone can see that on the screen. As Laura said, we're a London-based practice. We're working in multiple sectors, doing theatres, housing, cultural work, and education. Many of our projects are based in London, but we've also built across the UK, and we're currently working as far afield as Malmo and Boston and New Zealand. And for us, design is really a collaboration and a process, not just internally, but we're also fortunate to work with some brilliant consultants, clients, and craftspeople, and all of these people play obviously a vital role in the design of our projects. We also collaborate with some brilliant artists who often bring a different focus to areas of the design that could otherwise be purely functional. So just by way of introduction, here's some examples of some of the artist collaborations we've worked on. This stair at the Donmar Warehouse was painted by Anthony Malinowski. There's a gate at the Royal College of Art designed by Max Lamb. And the toilets here are from the London Library, and that was a collaboration with Martin Creed. So these just help to illustrate some of the way that collaborations can bring interest and enrich the the architectural process. So today we're just going to talk about 3 case studies that Elizabeth and I have been involved with over the last few years. First off, Kingston School of Art, which is a major refurbishment and extension for a building in Kingston, built in the 1970s. Meiji House, which is a large estate regeneration project in South London, involving the refurbishment and extension of a 1960s tower building, provide social housing for the borough. And the Warburg Institute, which is a refurbishment and extension of a 1950s Charles Holden designed building in Bloomsbury, in central London. So the common thread that connects all these, apart from the fact we've worked on them and they're all in London, is they're all existing buildings with extensions. And so it's interesting to consider the existing building almost as their own actor within the design process, with its own voice, setting rules to follow, opportunities and constraints, and how we kind of reconcile the needs of the project brief and all the various other people involved with the needs of the building itself, and how we extract the embedded knowledge within the building and the institution. So this is a painting depicting the death of Ophelia, painted by the pre-Raphaelite painter John Edward Millais, and this was painted on the banks of the River Hogsmill, which is one of London's lesser known rivers. It connects to the River Thames in Kingston, which is one of the outer boroughs in the west of the city. So about 90 years after that painting was painted, the Kingston School of Art was established on the banks of the Hogsmill River, and it was originally within this attractive 1930s building, completed in 1939, and it's a somewhat unique spot for an art school in many ways, because it's removed from the big central London institutions, and so it's a place with a kind of calmer energy, and a place where people can focus on thinking and making and creating, and actually the school's ethos is thinking through making, and so that was something we had to work hard to reinforce through our design. So in the subsequent years, that's the 1930s wing, the corner of it there. The school extended all the way along this part of the river. Building was added in the 1950s here. A tower was built in the 1960s. And then this large building in the foreground was built in the 1970s and provided some 8,000 square meters of studio workshop space. And it's this building where the majority of our work was focused. And so it's clearly a robust building. It's a factory-like structure with the concrete frame, with red engineering bricks. You can see the internal image here. It's a very kind of functional building in many ways, but with good underlying structure. But it had a lot of issues. This is the south facade. It suffered horrendously from overheating, and on the sort of north side, a lot of the building was occupied by plant space, and north lights absolutely brilliant for design studios. So it's a real shame that so much of the north facade was taken up with plant. And there's also not many views into the building from the public realm either. So a decision was made fairly early on to adapt and reuse the existing building as far as possible. We would strip it back to its frame, and basically undertake a series of tweaks, repairs, adjustments, treating the building like an old machine almost in need of a service. And by reusing the building, we were able to keep the school operational throughout the work through phasing. The building's home to a lot of complex workshops, so it would be very difficult to move off site. It also obviously holds a huge amount of embodied carbon, the concrete and steel structure and the bricks. So by reusing as much of that as possible, we reduce the carbon required to deliver the project. And universities have in the UK at least, have hundreds of buildings of this era, which need imaginative responses to their refurbishment. So it's almost an exemplar adaptive reuse project, looking to achieve a CO2 reduction of about 52% and achieve BREEAM Outstanding. So it also helps to retain the character. There's a culture and character that's built up in the existing site that we were keen to not completely throw away. So we replaced all the glazing on the job. We needed to address the overheating on the south. We decided to extend the lift and stair towers up to serve the 5th floor, which primarily before was just plant space. And we introduced a new sort of small extension onto Mill Street to allow access to other parts of the university campus across the river. On the north side, by relocating all that plant space, we were able to introduce a lot of north-facing design studios, all with their own roof terraces and access to green roofs, which we added to these large areas of flat roof. And we also created views into the workshops as well at ground floor. So with any project like this, there's a negotiation between dozens of different stakeholders. And in this case, we had 9 individual art and design departments, a dozen different workshop disciplines, the estates team, senior leadership team, staff, students, residents, planning authorities, facility managers, IT managers, lots and lots of different voices in the process. So I just wanted to pick up 1 or 2 of the narratives from that process today. So one of the end user clients was Richard Trupp, who was the enthusiastic head of workshops. And he was a real strong advocate for the thinking through making ethos that binds these various disciplines. He was an apprentice of Anthony Caro, the sculptor. And this is actually a pair of Anthony Caro's boots that still occupy space within the metal workshops of the building. So through working with Caro, he kind of honed his craft for steel sculpture and developed skills and techniques for building these enormous steel structures with no visible fixings and with lots of hidden engineering involved. And that's gone on to inform his own work. This image on the right is one of his own pieces. And so in parallel to having conversations with people like Richard about the workshop layouts and the design for those, we are also developing our own details really for some of the new features of the building. And so one of the things we're working on was how to address the overheating issue to the south, and we started to devise these sculptural window surrounds that would be fabricated in steel and inserted into the window structure, into the reveals, to allow the windows to sit further back in the reveal, but also introduce a projecting ledge that would help to cut out large parts of the solar gain. So we worked from that. We worked with specialist craftsmen and consultants who advised on some of the detailing, and we worked up some of the sketches with them. And this is just one of the early sort of working sketches to kind of start to decide or make some design decisions about how these inserts would be detailed. And we actually ended up avoiding any bolt fixings through the fins in the final design. But you can start to see here some of the steel folds that help to just give rigidity to the overall structure, and the fins themselves, which project sort of 700-800 mil. They started to borrow from aircraft wing technology to create a kind of really rigid body that could span the full width of the reveal. And of course, then we're working with the steel fabricators as well, developing the working drawings. And this is a photograph from the factory of the drawings laid out on the raw material before it's been cut. The cutting patterns laid out to reduce material waste. So there's kind of quite a lot of digital process in this as well. And then the steel's kind of cut in very large sheets. And the image on the right kind of just shows the corner of one of those projecting aerofoil fins with the steel wrapped around the blades. So each of these assemblies was then prefabricated in the workshop, and the head of the factory actually lives on site, which is quite handy because he could come out and check the assemblies, and they were pre-weathered in the courtyard, so he could go out and kind of hose them down in the morning and just help them oxidize in the sunshine. So this shows a photograph of the completed south facade with those window inserts in place. And the weathering steel was chosen not just because of its raw sculptural qualities, but also because it has other design benefits as well. It's got a tonal similarity to the patina of the building's aged bricks. It's also material that will weather and age naturally over time, allowing it to bed in with the existing weathered appearance of the building. And so much like the brickwork as well, it's long-lasting, durable, and doesn't need regular refinishing over the lifetime of the building. So we used the material for all new elements added to the outside of the building. So we have, this is the small extension onto Mill Street with the entrance to the new workshops. And here we had sort of quite large panels fabricated. And along the south facade as well, these smaller, these grouped bays along the south facade drop down and form benches all the way along the riverfront. Which were then covered in steel, covered in timber to avoid rust transferring onto clothes as people sit down. So there's a sense that there's some sort of dialogue between the craft and the fabrication of the new additions to the structure and the functions housed within the workshops. And these are just some photos from part of the metal workshop where they're doing some welding. And within weeks of moving into the building, they were fabricating their own coat hooks for their welding jackets, and there's a kind of continued evolution of the building even once we've left. And generally, the workshops were arranged according to their functions. So different functional processes were grouped, and through dialogues with people, some of the technicians, we introduced screens between workshops so that they could oversee different spaces, and introduce screens for controlling noise and dust and different processes. And the idea is that all the workshops in the building are completely open access and available to all staff and all students on all courses, which opens up lots of interesting possibilities and crossovers. The design studios, previously to the refurbishment, as courses expanded and contracted, there were real issues with having to constantly be refurbishing the building and knocking walls down and rebuilding them. And it was a hugely wasteful process. So one of the things we came up with was a sort of flexible infrastructure of good sized studios, all with a sort of flexible infrastructure of power, pin boards, sinks, storage, projectors, and so on, so that courses could expand and contract into different spaces without the need for kind of constant and costly alterations of the building fabric. So this just shows one of those studio units with the corridor, with glass onto the corridor views in, and the furniture and pinboard surfaces. And this is it in occupation, and the joinery was all designed so that it could be swapped in and out. So if a course moved, the joinery units could come out and they could take them with them and slot them into the new studios. So famous Kingston resident, Edward Muybridge, you'll know his time and motion studies helped facilitate the evolution of the image into a time-based medium. And we were very careful to try and co-locate all the image-based workshops. So you have this this lineage between printmaking, photography, moving image, animation, motion capture, and digital media, all within the same part of the building and reflecting hundreds of years of the evolution of the image from a static medium all the way to a time-based and a digital medium. And so someone can design a new typography set in the digital media lab. They can get it 3D printed. They can cast the typographic sets into metal. They can use a 19th century printing press to produce a book at the end of it. You've got other processes such as the architects being able to have their drawings digitally knitted, using the fashion workshops. And there's a lot of potential within those crossovers for exciting possibilities for creativity and innovation. And this is one of the moving image workshops in use. And so, behind all these kind of ideas and great facilities, there's hundreds of people actually contributing towards the construction of a project, and following lots of discussions about the purest, least reflective, most durable white paint to create this backdrop for the digital film studios. Underneath it all, the building is still in a lot of places remarkably low tech, and you've still got someone kind of painting an infinity wall in the project. So all those people play a part in how the building comes together, and all have their own advice to contribute to that process. So at that point, I will hand over to Elizabeth. Are you there, Elizabeth?
I'm here, thank you.
Great.
So the two projects that I'm going to talk about differ slightly from Kingston School of Art in the sense that they haven't yet started on site, so they haven't been finished. So I'm going to be focusing a bit more on the early design process and how we reached the final designs. So the first is Meiji House. It's a 27-storey brutalist tower block in Southwark in South London. And we won the scheme via a competition in 2015 for the full refurbishment and the extension of the tower. It's a residential building. It contains 144 social rent apartments. And this project was intended to be a landmark project for Southwark Council. They really wanted to show an alternative between kind of full demolition or privatisation that was happening to a lot of other brutalist social housing estates around London. The site's located in Bermondsey in South London, and the tower itself sits adjacent to Southwark Park, which is a large listed Victorian park to the east, and then to the west faces the main railway link coming into London Bridge from the south. So it's in a very prominent location, and due to its height and the kind of low suburban context, it benefits from long views from a lot of different areas in South London, so it's fairly well known. It was originally built in 1966 by London County Council as part of the wider development of the Abbeyfield estate, which was primarily comprised of low-rise blocks and large areas of public space and landscape. So we started the project by carrying out some initial research, and we found that several other iterations of this tower had actually already been built all over London in slightly kind of different configurations of the same design. We also found a few examples of those that had already been refurbished and already been overclad. But these sort of served to us as what we wanted to avoid and what we didn't want to do, particularly as we felt the kind of grain and the essence of the existing building had really been lost in the refurbishment, and the facades had become very flat and lacked kind of contrast. So we also spent a lot of time on site talking to residents and really getting to know the building and understanding the various issues that it faced. The key issue for us was really the kind of lower 2 stories and the sort of public realm and ground floor, As with many similar estates, there was the idea of sort of streets in the sky. And so the building has a long convoluted ramp which goes up to the first floor to access the main entrance, and a large single-storey podium area that contains car parking. So it has very little public face or kind of active frontage to the estate. And next to the building there is, shown in pink on the diagram, there's a community centre, which again is suffering from similar problems on the kind of ground floor space, and also was suffering from really sort of poor condition and out-of-date services. So we wanted to try and address that community centre at the same time as part of the project. So this slide just gives a kind of overview of the various parts of our proposal. The first move being to demolish this podium level ramp and kind of first floor gallery. And in doing so, we freed up a lot of the site to create large new residential facilities and new residential entrance and communal spaces, shown in yellow, and then adjacent to that, a new community centre, purpose-built building, shown in pink, which kind of wraps around the back of the building. And then in addition, the existing tower's structure had been designed with quite a lot of extra capacity. And this opened up the opportunity to add a 5-storey extension to give another 24 homes on top of the existing tower. As well as looking at what we felt didn't work about the tower, we also kind of appraised what we felt really did work. And essentially we felt that it was a really strong piece of architecture and brutalist design, particularly its kind of good bone structure, as we coined it. And this was a sketch that we did in the bid stage, so right at the beginning of the project. But this only became more clear once the building had been fully stripped out and all the windows had been removed, and this kind of bone structure of the concrete frame and the concrete spandrel panels really became apparent, showing the building's kind of essential character. Next came the challenge of designing a new facade for the building and new cladding. And as well as wanting it to be a landmark project, Southwark Council had given the brief of no maintenance for the facade. So wanting to avoid cleaning or any kind of regular maintenance at height, which really limited the amount of materials that we could choose. So we built a large scale model, or several models, to explore the different options for the cladding. The first thing we looked at was a sort of profiled perforated aluminium cladding in a sort of zigzag pattern that would have been really eye-catching, quite kind of highly contemporary, really answering the landmark part of the client's brief. The second was a glazed terracotta tile, slightly more kind of robust material, but that also could be really attractive and kind of shimmer in the light and create a kind of really new look for the tower. And the third was this profiled glass reinforced concrete, which is quite a kind of tough and fairly brutalist expression, kind of sculptural cladding that we felt also could work. But the ultimate option that was chosen was the terracotta tile. We visited Terracotta Factory in Germany and chose a kind of profile design that we felt would really add this kind of effect of the light changing across the building, particularly as you approach it on the train and coming around it in 3 dimensions, approaching London Bridge Station. Next, we looked at the kind of window and fenestration design for the new tower. We looked back to the original 1960s design and discovered that the windows that had been replaced in the 1980s with PVC had really lost the original pattern. And that was something that we really liked and really wanted to reinstate, including the kind of two-tone nature of having these pale openable frames and then darker fixed frames to add a bit of contrast and more texture. Then when it came to designing the extension for the tower, to be honest, we didn't really explore many options for this area, as we felt the kind of most honest thing to do was just to continue the design of the existing tower within the new top, albeit with slightly raised floor to ceiling heights, so sort of slightly increased glazing. But instead of kind of creating a glazed top hat or something that had a lot of extra contrast. What we did do, however, was add in what we called the shadow gap floor in between the existing building and the new extension, just to kind of state the difference between the new and old. When it came to the internal apartments within the building, the existing apartment design is shown now on the left. These are scissor plan kind of interlocking flats, which sit on 3 levels each. All the bedrooms face the park and all the living spaces face the street, which is a really clever piece of design. Unfortunately, however, within the new extension shown on the right, it's quite difficult to recreate these sort of scissor plan layouts today, just due to sort of construction costs and building regulations. It's quite challenging. But instead, we made sure that all of the units that we designed within the new extension were duplex, so 2-storey, to really kind of continue the intentions of the original tower. Then it came to designing the base of the building, and this was an area we found particularly challenging. Once we'd sort of stripped away the ramp and the podium level in our minds, we were left with this quite big 2-storey area facade. And we started by drawing a lot of kind of glazed, lightweight curtain wall options, but felt that the tower really needed something more solid to land on. So at this point, we looked to other towers that we felt where the base had been designed slightly more successfully. And we found this precedent here, which is Sheffield University Arts Tower, which has this quite robust base. We then built a model of the base of Meiji House Tower. So on the left here, you can see that kind of solid structural rhythm landing the tower at the ground floor and first floor. Meanwhile, at the back of the tower, we designed the new community centre, and that was given a much more kind of free form expression, kind of facing the park and allowing it to do its own thing. So these are 2 axonometric drawings that just show the layout of the lower 2 floors. On the left is the ground floor with the community centre shown in pink and the residential areas shown in grey. So this includes a large new entrance foyer for the residential part of the building, which leads to a kind of big wide stair leading up to the first floor level, where there's kind of additional communal spaces and a communal rooftop garden on top of the community centre. And then the community centre, this could be an entirely separate project in itself, but just quickly explain about it. There's 4 key spaces shown there in red, and each of those spaces were given a slightly better floor to ceiling height and their own individual roof expression to give them a bit of personality and difference. And then these spaces are connected together by the sort of ancillary spaces shown in blue, the kind of long circulation route shown in yellow, and then some interstitial yard, like courtyard spaces that help give them extra daylighting and ventilation facade. This is a CGI of the community centre hall looking out to the park. And this one shows the entrance to the community centre from New Public Square with the base of Meiji House on the right-hand side. And then finally, these 2 show the main entrance to Meiji House on the left, and on the right, the community centre looking out to the park. So the next project I'm going to talk about is the Warburg Institute, which is the project that Mara is studying alongside us. It's a historic library and higher education institution, which forms part of the University of London, focusing mainly on the study of cultural history and the role of image in culture. So again, we won this project via a competition in 2018 for the full refurbishment and extension of the building. The site's located in Bloomsbury in central London, which is really close to Euston Station and the British Museum, so very central. However, historically, the Warburg Institute actually began life in Hamburg as part of the private collection of Abby Warburg, who was an art historian and cultural theorist. He founded the Institute at the end of the 19th century, and it quickly became really well known for the study of cultural science. And as the Institute grew, Abby Warburg became increasingly involved with the architectural design of the new spaces, particularly this oval-shaped reading room, which was the main space of the Institute where many scholars would gather. Then in 1933, the Institute relocated to London to escape the war, and after a few years became incorporated as part of the University of London, was eventually given its own purpose-built home within the university's large master plan designed by Charles Holden, which you can see here on the left, and the Warburg Institute in the bottom left-hand corner. And this master plan was largely unbuilt, so the Warburg is one of the few buildings from this master plan that was actually constructed. These are some photos of the interior when it was finished. It was finished in 1957. And on the left is the reading room, on the right is the lecture theatre. These were done in a kind of quite classic 1950s style, which was in some ways fairly dated for the time. Here we can see some photos of the library on the upper floors. So the top 4 floors of the building are these book stacks designed by Charles Holden as well. And this is the Warburg as it is today. So in many ways, it's remained largely untouched. It hasn't had any kind of big building projects or reconfigurations, but it has kind of developed this layer of sort of silting or kind of over cladding over time. So it suffers from really poor services and technical infrastructure. Its other main problem is that it lacks a real public face, and it isn't as well known as other similar libraries and museums and institutes. And the building's design doesn't really help with this. So you can see here on the ground floor, many of the windows are kind of clad over with this white opaque film, which prevents any views from the streets inside, and you can't see what's going on inside the Institute. Secondly, the main entrance lacks any real signage and is kind of tucked away around the quietest aspect of the building. And together with these quite regular, austere facades, it is quite a sort of intimidating building to visit, particularly if you're a member of the public and you want to find out what's inside. And this kind of intimidating aspect of the building does also continue in the interior. So this red line shows the route from the main entrance to the library. And to travel along this route, you have to go through several layers of kind of security around the entrance foyer, and then down a long dog-legged corridor and past lots of cellular office space. So again, it isn't very open and inviting and welcoming to new users. That's sort of shown here. So the main entrance on the left, the entrance foyer with these sort of glazed screen barrier in the middle, and then this long dog-legged corridor on the right. But what we felt did work about the building, well, to us, the real joy and quality is in the materials and details, and perhaps not so much in the internal layout. We spent a lot of time in the Warburg Institute getting to know readers and academic staff and what they liked about the building, and also carried out a room by room kind of forensic survey of where these areas of quality and kind of nice materials still existed. And on top of sort of finishes materials of the building, there's also a great deal of quality in the furniture, both designed by Abby Warburg and also Charles Holden. And in the signage designed by Holden that many people know the building for, and in its sort of integrated artwork, such as this plaster frieze. So in starting the project, there were 2 key aims. The first was to open the building up and create views through the interior and also through the facade from outside to in. And secondly, to kind of improve orientation and visibility and to really populate the route from the entrance to the library to make it more inviting for the public and new users. This is our proposed ground floor plan, and you can see here we've kind of grouped together more of these public functions like the common room, exhibition space, lecture room and classrooms. We've also opened up the entrance foyer to become bigger, more open plan, more welcoming, and created open plan space shown in blue against the kind of main facade to really allow views in and also animate the route to the library. And then in the middle there, you can see outlined in blue is the new extension that we have proposed in the courtyard. On the lower ground floor, the space is largely given over to collections, but within our new extension outlined in blue, we're proposing a new reading room that can be shared by these collections that were previously buried away in other corners of the Institute. On the upper floors, this is a typical upper floor plan. They all follow the same principles. And we've really allowed the library to just expand around the floor plate to allow for years of future growth, and have condensed some of the office and teaching space on the other wing of the building. So these are some early models showing our explorations into where we could add area to the building and how we could allow it to grow. Like I said, it was sort of ultimately decided that the best place to add this area was the lower two floors, where we could increase these kind of public functions. So on the right is an image of our eventual proposal of the courtyard extension. This is the courtyard in question, with its white glazed ceramic tiles cladding that contrast with the brick of the street-facing facades. And then with the extension, we started by exploring the kind of vertical spatial divisions and hierarchy and the different options that we had for creating space in the courtyard. So this started with sketches and then followed through to models. So we built this is a 1:25 scale, so really large scale model of the courtyard space. And the first option was a raked lecture theatre, the seating that steps down from the ground floor to the lower ground floor. The second option was for a more kind of cavernous volume with a kind of gallery level and then lower ground floor level below. And then the third was for a 2-storey extension that was separated from the existing building by double height light wells either side. And this option was ultimately decided upon by the client as it gave the most usable area within the building for their money and created a flat floor lecture theatre, but still had the kind of spatial drama through these light wells. So the lecture theatre is shown here on the ground floor. And typically lecture theatres are quite closed down, quite dark spaces. However, we wanted to create these views through the building. So we designed these glazed walls that could be screened with blinds to kind of add drama and sort of theatre when it was in use and not in use. And through every point in the process of this design, we asked ourselves, what would the original architect Charles Holden do if he was in our position in designing this new extension? So we looked back to a lot of his original work and found that the kind of running thread that ran through many of his projects was this expression of structure in the forms of beams and columns. And this was really true whether it was an industrial space such as a tube station or a much kind of more finer, more elegant space such as Meiji House. So this structural expression is something that we brought into our own designs. And it also had the effect of really helping us separate the new design from the existing courtyard walls and clarifying the difference between the new extension and the existing. And at this point in the design process, the client threw us a slight curveball when they started asking, well, you know, what about the ellipse? And referring to Abby Warburg's elliptical roof light that featured in the design of his reading room in Hamburg. So we were then faced with the challenge of incorporating this quite organic element into our quite regular gridded design. So we developed the model a bit further and came up with 3 different options for how this could work. So the first was that the ellipse could be conceived as a sort of elliptical sculpture or piece of artwork that would be suspended beneath the beams of the lecture theatre. But the kind of criticism of this option was perhaps that this was a bit too lightweight, a bit sort of tacked on, and not a kind of Warburg's original idea. The second option looked at kind of marrying together the ideas of both Holden and Warburg by making the ellipse an integral part of the extension structure. And the third option really gave precedent to the ellipse by hiding the structure above a kind of plaster ceiling and letting the ellipse take this sort of really pure form, quite a direct translation of the Hamburg precedent. Ultimately, the client decided on option 2, as it was felt that the marrying together of both Holden and Warburg's ideas was quite strong and gave quite an elegant expression across the ceiling. Internally, we looked to finish this new space very much in keeping with the interiors of the existing institute and Holden's designs. So we've specified a kind of dark woodblock floor and also some slatted timber paneling, which both directly feature in Holden's building, but also introduce some new materials like this white polished concrete and grey felt infill in the ceiling between the structural elements. And then finally, this is a view standing on the existing balcony of the Warburg Institute next to the existing reading room, looking over and into the new extension with the lecture theatre inside and the new reading room below. So yeah, I think that's all we have time for today, though. I could talk about this project endlessly, but thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. Then I will ask you to stop sharing the screens and also ask our third person in the conversation, Mara Trübenbach, to also turn on her camera, because in the tradition of these talks, what we have asked is for the PhD researchers within this research network to prepare questions that relate to their research, your work, because of course we would not be appropriately addressing a tacit knowledge network if we did not have the kind of academic reflection and the professional expertise in conversation and in dialogue. So Mara Trübenbach is an architect and PhD researcher at EHO in Oslo, the architecture school, and she's very interested in the intersection of design methods, craft, and material in architecture. Prior to joining the TACK network, she graduated from the Bauhaus University in Weimar, home of craft, with an MSc in architecture in 2018, having studied before at the Peter Behrens School of Arts in Düsseldorf and at the Technical University in Vienna. She's gained a cross-disciplinary professional horizon ranging from interior design through landscape architecture in a number of offices across Europe, including Ortner and Ottner Baukunst and Coop Himmelblau. She's done research on provenances and migration movement in architecture and related subjects. And in the summer of 19, she was selected for the Bauhaus Lab program at the Bauhaus Dessau Foundation. A collectively designed, a curated exhibition and an accompanying pocketbook was published in relation to this workshop. And in that year, she gave a talk at the Isocone Gallery in London and was invited to speak at the Design History Society annual conference at Northumbria and Newcastle. So Mara, welcome. And I will give the floor to you to open up the conversation with questions you have for our architects.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Lara, and also thank you, Elizabeth and Dan, for your indeed inspiring presentation. This gave us a brief insight into how you work within the office and also showcased your precise and also your sensitive view of architecture. So I've been lucky enough to have spoken to you a couple of times in the past few months. And it has always been a pleasure to talk about your project and all the different people involved. And in my first question, I would like to build up on this work in progress that you have described in your presentation. So this links to the motion of tacit knowledge, which you have dealt with at Kingston University and also the Meiji House and the Warburg Institute, where you have all these disparate pieces that create a unique infrastructure. And I'd be curious, to what extent do you transfer tacit knowledge from these different periods in your design process?
Shall I start, Elizabeth? Thanks, Mara. Yeah, no, it's been very enjoyable to have you engaging with our practice as well, and asking us questions. So I think you know, we're quite fortunate, I think, as a practice to have quite a selection of interesting people and different people with different specialisms, and so I think, you know, we've got a strong culture of pinning up, of sharing work, of presenting work to each other, and I think that kind of studio culture really helps to facilitate the transfer of knowledge, you know, within the studio. So, you know, we've got people who are specialists in certain technologies, in historic buildings, in sustainability. We've got a head of sustainability now. And of course, PhD students like yourself, who you know, can all feed into that kind of knowledge transfer and dialogue on all of our projects. And you know, that's become a bit more challenging, I think, over the last few months with a bit more remote working. So we've had to kind of adapt the tools we use and how we share information internally.
I would say that the kind of transfer on tacit knowledge, particularly on the Warburg Institute, is something that definitely doesn't happen in a straight line. I think for us, we build up a lot of knowledge about the building and about how we can approach it throughout the process, and then go back and forth across different pieces of knowledge. Particularly on the Warburg, where the client didn't have a very clear vision of what they wanted right at the beginning of the project. And so you explore lots of options and often end up going back to something you previously discarded. So it's this real process of layering and gradual building up of knowledge that results in the kind of end design.
And that stuff takes time, you know, and I think a lot of the time in, you know, the way work is sometimes procured these days, the space, not enough space sometimes is given for iteration, and you know, you're given some very tight programs to work to sometimes, which, you know, which really make it difficult to have the layer of the detail of conversation and design that you need to arrive to the most appropriate solution. So yeah, that's an issue that we sort of constantly try and come up against.
Yeah, thank you. This also somehow links to the next question, when you say that, yeah, this kind of time is an issue, or that you have this conversation as, yeah, a tacit knowledge also. And my next question is more about this interaction of material as an intermediary, since material may provide the starting point for an idea and draws out certain actions. So in addition to building regulations and specifications for sustainable materials, how's the choice of materials reflected in your design process?
I think, you know, in terms of design process, I think what Elizabeth was talking to, she showed some models of some 1:25 models that were produced for the Warburg, and it's a scale that theatre set designers use as well. And I think, you know, you could probably tell from our presentation that we like to use models as a tool, and the good thing about that is it allows you to explore material in a quite a direct way. And 1:25 on certain projects like the Warburg, where you're trying to get to grips with texture and light and space and material, it allows you at that scale to really understand how materials are going to impact space. And so I think that's just one way that that material does start to creep into the actual process of design within our practice.
May I jump in for a minute? Because Elizabeth, you used this phrase forensic survey, which I thought was very charming. I can kind of imagine you going through this building as a detective in search of more beauty. I was wondering, is this something that the office has used before as a kind of frame, as an idea of how to handle this, or did it come out of the Warburg? Was it a method that you were familiar with?
I myself hadn't actually done it before, but I'd sort of seen similar things on other existing building projects. For a building like the Warburg, so it's 6 stories, a number of different spaces, lots of offices given over to academics who themselves have their own kind of collections within their offices. They might have kind of lived in those offices for like 10 years. So we basically carried out a photographic survey, which is numbered by room and links back to the plans. So whenever we're in the office and drawing in CAD in quite a technical way, we can also simultaneously look back to the existing building and look right inside that particular office and immediately get in touch with its kind of character and contents without being there. So it's a really useful tool.
On the Kingston School of Art project as well, because that particular project we had quite detailed 3D point cloud surveys done. So we had sort of digital twin of the original building with all its capture that particular moment of time as a kind of, it's now quite an archival thing to look at because it's a kind of piece of history. But I think whilst having all the digital tools is great, there's no substitute for just spending lots of time in a place. And we sometimes go and work in the Warburg, or hang around after meetings for the rest of the day just to try and get to grips with certain issues. And as Elizabeth said, that then leads to conversations with people and interactions that you don't get from sitting remotely at your desk. So yeah, that's just another quite interesting thing that just comes out of being forensic or being quite detailed and being present in the building.
Yeah, so this also, what you just mentioned, this kind of also educational tool, I would say, within the office to share this detailed plans with photographs and have this, everything is related in an archive. Somehow is an educational tool. And one of my other questions is, somehow summarizes the previous questions about these periods, the different periods you have within the building, like also the historical times, and material as carriers of tacit knowledge, because you work a lot with existing buildings. You come across materials in various phases that allow you to move along geographical, historical, and also cultural borders. So the material acts probably also in a, let's say, educational sense. And I was wondering, what is the relationship between material as a critical substance and as designing tool in your office?
I think what a lot of our projects share, something Lara alluded to in the introduction, is it's more the approach of how we kind of tackle looking at an existing building. So in terms of as an educational tool, particularly on the Warburg, we look back to the London Library and the process that that team had been through from the kind of beginning, their own initial forensic investigation to the eventual building. So like you say, we have this kind of archive of projects, and that really each one teaches us how to address the next one.
And I think it's interesting you talked about the critical material having taking a critical view of materials, something like that. It was, you know, looking at materials that went into buildings like the Warburg. You know, at the time, material choices were driven by very different things than they are today. And so, you know, it's not just a case of trying to replicate things that were put into the building 50, 60, 100 years ago, but to think critically about the materials used and how we can make better choices now for the environment and for other purposes. And, you know, local materials, for example. And so one of the tools that Diana, our head of sustainability, is developing is actually our in-house material database library to, you know, to fully try and look into materials in a very critical way, and use that as an internal tool for all projects to use to make better informed decisions about materials that we use on projects. So that's quite a positive sort of new development in the office that's helping to give designers extra tools to use in relation to material.
So then, yeah, like you said, it then also somehow, yeah, leads you in a way, this material, and yeah, it's an educational tool within your design process. I don't know if we have another.
We, you know, this would be roughly the time to round off, which I think would be a great time for one extra question if you.
Yeah, well, I would have one extra question, which is, yeah, more a general one. So what is the major source of inspiration in the office? So because you said you have this, yeah, database where you can look up material, and you have also the archive where you can check previous projects. But is there another tool or another method, yeah, which maybe is kind of yeah, an inspiration in your office?
Yeah, I think you know, on existing buildings, yeah, the building itself is obviously somewhere that we often start, and then, you know, we try and map similar kinds of precedents and material from, you know, from similar architects or similar periods, so that we can start to get a deeper understanding of some of the drivers there, and to try and situate it within that kind of era and that place and that context. So you know, we're quite I'd say we're quite research heavy. You know, we go to a lot of sources, and we don't necessarily recycle the same inspiration, you know, for each project. We try and start with what that particular project needs to do, and, you know, and then we kind of go from there, and at that point we start to kind of build up the blocks, and so it's quite a broad spectrum of material. And, you know, with engaging with yourself, for example, on our current design for the Warburg, you know, you're helping us to uncover archival material in Hamburg, you know, which is in German, which you know, would be hard for us to access in the current climate, and hopefully will then start to feed in its own way into our thinking.
We do precedent as well in the research phase, particularly in trying to communicate different ideas to the client and in our own discussions. And for any given project, we'll look at you know, maybe hundreds of different buildings, just to kind of seen a lot of different references. But then ultimately, rather than kind of taking any large ideas from any one particular project, it always seems to end up as this sort of process of picking out the smaller parts of different projects that we feel could work or apply to our own project. And again, it's quite a forensic process of yeah, going through what works elsewhere and how we can apply that to our own work.
Mara, are you okay with this, or you seem to have a kind of situation?
I'm absolutely fine. So no, there was a great answer, and yeah, it's great to collaborate. And what you just said, like exchanging also this knowledge in also in other languages, and so yeah, I'm fine with the answer.
No, it seemed like you had another question. I really appreciate also, I think, what I noticed in the way that both of you were treating this issue is not just, say, a forensics about like finding the things that are uncovered, but in a way, the way both of you talk about these buildings is talking in a way as if they are living characters. They very much personify the life of the building. And the way that you also use the historical figures that are prominent in the life of the building, Holden, Warburg, Caro, and Muybridge. It's a very interesting kind of combination of both the life within and the life of, which I think is quite beautiful. With that, I'd like to thank all three of you for preparing a lecture, for preparing questions, for engaging in this conversation to talk through some of the aspects that typically don't get discussed quite as much. That concludes this first cycle of TACK Talks. We hope that we will be back with all of you for more. And in the meantime, that's wishing everyone a very happy, healthy summer. And thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.